Hi everyone. The myth I'm exploring today is playing violent video games makes people more aggressive. This is a question that has sparked decades of debate between parents, gamers, and scientists alike. My big idea is that while violent video games might temporarily influence aggressive thoughts, long-term evidence does not support the idea that they make players more aggressive in real life. Let's start with the first study, The More You Play, the More Aggressive You Become, by Hassan and colleagues. This was a 3-day experimental study involving 70 college students. Participants were randomly assigned to play either violent or non-violent video games for 20 minutes each day. Aggression was measured by how much unpleasant noise participants blasted to an opponent, a classic psychological lab test of aggressive behavior. Over the 3 days, those who played violent video games became more aggressive and also developed a stronger hostile expectation, meaning that they started to assume that others would act aggressively towards them. The author concluded that violent video games had a cumulative effect. The more you play, the more aggressive you become. However, the study used a very small and short-term sample, only 70 adults, for about 3 days, so it tells us more about the short-term effects of violence rather than real-world behavior. Now compare that with a much larger register report by Shabelsky and Weinstein. They studied over 1,000 British teens and their parents. Instead of a lab setting, they collected real-world data on games teens actually played and how much time they spent playing them. Crucially, parents, not teens, rated their adolescents' aggression, which reduced the bias. Their findings were clear that was no link between violent video games and aggressive behavior. Even when they tested for a nonlinear tipping point, like playing too much suddenly caused aggression, they found nothing. In other words, this large pre-registered study contradicts Hassan's small experimental one. So how do we make sense of these contradictions? Methodology. Hassan's experiment was controlled by artificial means and measured aggression in lab settings, while Pavinsky's was correlational but realistic, based on everyday life. Participants. Hassan's studied adults over 3 days, while Pavinsky's studied teens over time. Measures. Hassan used a noise blasting test, while Pavinsky used parental ratings of real behavior. Conclusion. Hassan found that short-term lab effects, while Pavinsky found no real-world connection. To me, this suggests that Hassan's result captured momentary frustration or arousal, not genuine anger or aggressive behavior outside of the lab. Pavinsky's data, with its large representative sample and pre-registered design, feels more convincing to me. Looking at the data collected by our class, this graph shows the most common game rating being teen and the most common answer being I don't play video games. Then looking at this graph, we see a range of video game hours played, the most common being 0 to 4.3. This graph shows the average hours of each category of how often they shout when gaming. And there's little variation between this never, rarely, and sometimes category, and with the often being the least amount of average hours played, showing that there might not be much of a correlation between average hours gamed and how often they get aggressive. In this graph, we can see the distribution of people's urges to yell when playing video games. Sometimes is at the highest and always is at the lowest, suggesting that when we reference this with the other graph, that playtime does not necessarily influence aggression. The myth that violent video games cause aggression isn't supported by strong evidence. Short-term, lab-based studies show small temporary effects, but large real-world studies show no meaningful relationship between gaming violence and actual aggressive behavior. Before assuming that video games are the problem, let's look at the evidence and focus on other factors that truly influence aggression, like stress, family conflict, or mental health. Thank you.